You're listening to dkitalk.com.
And that person is now eliminated from the process. Now, I forget who it was. Let's say it was Seamus Bellew.
So you might have a couple of hundred votes.
Correct.
Of people who gave you their number one.
Exactly.
You're no longer in the game.
Exactly.
Your votes are now up.
Correct.
To have something done with them.
Yes.
Right. And this is on the basis now that no one has reached the quota.
Nobody's reached the quota. Okay. So what the counters now do is Seamus Bellew is now eliminated, and all those papers say number one, Seamus Bellew. And now we look at the number twos. So the counters count how many number twos did Dermot Ahern get from Seamus Bellew's pile? How many number twos did Fergus Dowd get from that pile? And those votes are now moved to those particular candidates.
It is important they physically take those. So, for example,
yes.
if Dermot Ahern gets 10 of this candidate, Seamus Bellew's votes, they are moved to Dermot Ahern's pile.
Yeah, to his area, that's correct.
Now, at the end of that, all of those ones that were moved will have added up to Seamus Bellew's total, except for the ones that there was no number twos given. For example, if people just voted for Seamus Bellew number one and nobody else, so they all add up. That's the important thing.
Well, those papers that you mentioned there that just say Seamus Bellew number one and nothing else, they're what we call non-transferable.
Right.
Or there's also the possibility that voter voted number one for Seamus Bellew and then somehow spoiled the vote after that. They might have done something like maybe 2 Liam O'Gogan, 2 Fergus Dowd. In which case the number one would probably still have been recognised as a correct vote at that stage, but at the next stage it would be spoiled and non-transferable at that stage.
Okay. Now, can I say, those non-transferable are effectively in the bin now, in terms of the count, is that correct?
Correct.
They're no longer going to ever be seen again?
No, that's correct.
Okay.
So now at this stage, the number twos were effective. Do you remember earlier on we said somehow the number twos might only be a preference, but now we actually see the number twos on these particular papers kind of kicking into action and being of value to another candidate.
So now at this stage, they're actually as equal value to a number one.
Correct.
In other words, now, if 10 of Seamus Bellew's papers are given over to Dermot Ahern in the second count, they have a value of 10
Correct.
Votes. Right.
Yeah. Equal to his number ones.
Yes.
In value, yeah. That's right. And the elimination process carries on.
So we're still now, as long as nobody has reached the quota, every time we eliminate someone, their papers are given, apart from any that might be spoiled and leave the game, or where the numbers is no longer given vote, those papers hold a value of one ballot paper as they're added to the different bundles, and the other bundles grow.
Correct.
Now, at some point, we get to a point where somebody has now reached this magic, let's say, 2001, made up of their original number ones plus all the bits that passed through.
That's right. Well, the Louth constituency is a good example just to start with. From a calculation point of view, it's good news when nobody gets elected on the first count, because you keep eliminating people and the process is relatively simple. So we'll say after the second count, Seamus Bellew, we're just using him as an example because I forgot who was eliminated. Seamus Bellew was eliminated and his votes were distributed. And let's just, for the sake of argument, say nobody was still elected. And that actually did happen in the Louth constituency. They kept eliminating people for a period of time. So what happens, let's say Liam O'Gogan is the next candidate to be eliminated. Now, Liam is eliminated and we look at the further preferences on his papers. Now, the interesting thing at this stage is Liam's papers are a mixture. Some of the papers say number one, Liam O'Gogan. But let's say Liam had got some papers from Seamus Bellew.
Because he wasn't the first one to be eliminated.
Correct.
Yes.
So Liam is now actually has papers that say Seamus Bellew number one, Liam O'Gogan number two. So in those particular papers, we're now looking at the number threes. And those papers will be moved on to the number three person.
No, I'm lost there.
Okay.
So just go with me again, because I say there's Liam O'Gogan, there's his number ones,
right,
then there's the ones he got from.
We'll start that again. And Seamus Bellew was eliminated on the second count, and now nobody has reached the quota, so we're going to move on to the third count, and let's say Liam O'Gogan is the next lowest candidate. So Liam is going to be eliminated. Now, before we see what happens with Liam's papers, let's just look at the bundles of papers that Liam has. Now, most of Liam's votes were number ones.
His original number
His original number ones. They said number one, Liam O'Gogan. Now, Liam actually wound up getting some papers from Seamus Bellew. Now, those papers said Seamus Bellew number one, Liam O'Gogan number two. Now, at this stage, Liam is now out of the race and he's eliminated. So it doesn't matter where the preference is on the paper, we just look at the next preference. So in the papers that say Liam O'Gogan number one, we now look at the number twos, the second preferences.
Of those papers.
And they decide where the papers go.
Right.
Now, the papers that had Seamus Bellew 1, Liam O'Gogan 2, we have to look at number 3 to see where the paper goes.
Okay.
But there's no difference in the papers. They just go the same way to the further candidate. And again,
it's important what we do. These papers physically go from A to B.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, the papers physically go from A to B.
But there's a fair amount of sorting again, because what the people are sorting need to go through them and say, create 2 bundles from Liam O'Gogan's papers. His original ones, because they were preference number 1, and we then give the number 2 preference to whoever gets them.
Well, there isn't really, that it's just, all Liam's papers are sort of just transferred. I don't think there's there's really no need to give them separate.
Right, okay.
Down the line the counters will sort of just explain as we go on. So Liam is now gone in his papers, and the process just keeps repeating itself. We keep eliminating people. We're still assuming nobody has reached the quota.
But for example, you could have a situation where, say, 4 or 5 people have been eliminated before anyone's reached the quota.
That's right.
And the 5th person being eliminated, their papers are now made up of their own plus a combination of 4 other people.
Yes, exactly.
And so we may be transferring some of those papers based on the number 2 preference and the number 3, 4, 5 and 6 papers.
Yeah, it's different preferences.
Yes.
But say, for argument's sake, let's say Ger Nash was eliminated at some stage down the line. Now, his papers are a mixture. He inherits the papers from different people. Now, let's say Ger is eliminated. And let's say, for argument's sake, we just look at one of Ger's number 1s. Let's say the number 2 was for Seamus Bellew on that paper. Now, Seamus has gone long ago. So that number 2, we now look at number 3. And let's say the number 3 said Liam O'Gogan. But Liam has gone a long time ago. So we keep going until we find a candidate.
Somebody active still there.
Still active.
Right, okay.
And the paper is just moved to that candidate.
Okay.
So the counter just needs to be alert that the different candidates, or whoever is gone, that they're taking care of whatever, and that the paper actually goes to a candidate that's still alive.
From a listening point of view, one thing I think is interesting about this type of conversation and recording, James, is that I've always felt that if I can just play that back again and say, what was he actually saying before they move forward? So I feel I have that sense of it now. We can move to the point where finally somebody in this constituency reaches a quota.
Reaches the quota.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, as it turns out, people just don't reach the quota. They reach the quota and more. So instead of just getting 2,001, you might get 2,100, for example. So now you have spare votes. You've been elected, and you have extra votes, so they have to be distributed. So
okay. Well, I suppose just to wrap up on the elimination, we kept the thing simple just initially. That I think most people have a sense of candidates being eliminated and those papers been passed on to other candidates. That's a relatively easy thing to follow. The complicated thing about PR is when we start looking at when a candidate gets a surplus, what happens in that situation? And that's where people find the thing a bit more confusing, maybe. So I suppose maybe the next thing is to maybe kind of try and tease that out a little bit.
Okay.
Now, before we go into the surplus, just a bit of ordinary sums that might help us later on. The whole process is called proportional representation. So just to explain the idea of a proportion. Now, most people going back to their school days would have done proportion and maybe understood bits and didn't understand bits.
I'll have the biggest half of the atom.
Exactly. So just to start off with a simple example. Suppose I have €120 and I'm going to divide it between 3 people. How much does each person get?
Well, if you divide them in equal proportion, they'll get €40.
€40, exactly. So divide the 120 equally between the 3 people, they get €40. So Liam just said there, you're dividing in equal proportion. You're giving them an equal weight. But we could also decide, well, for different reasons, let's say it was a work situation. We'll say let's say Liam. For some reason, Liam didn't do much work, so we'll only give him €1. And the next guy in the work situation was Seamus. And let's say he did more work than Liam. So for every euro Liam gets, we're going to give Seamus €5. And for every euro Liam gets, Seamus gets €5 and Anne will get €6. So we have 3 people in the game.
That's discrimination, Jim.
That's discrimination. Well,
as long as we're clear.
As long as it's clear. So for different reasons, we've decided different people are going to get different amounts, corresponding to the amount of work, let's say, for argument's sake. So to summarise that again, Liam is going to get €1, Seamus is going to get €5, and Anne will get €6. Now, how do we divide up the €120 to match that ratio? So we just go back to the basic units, the 1 unit for Liam, the 5 units for Seamus, and the 6 units for Anne. If we add those up, we get 12 units. So we get the 12 units, and we divide it into the 120. And we end up getting €10. So each unit corresponds to €10. So Liam is getting 1 unit, so we give him €10. Seamus is getting 5 units, so we give him €50. Anne is getting 6 units, so we give her €60.
So effectively, if we were doing that with papers, we'd be counting them out, 1 for you, 5 for you, 6 for you.
Correct.
And we go round to 10 times.
Exactly.
And 10 times round, Liam would get 10, Seamus would get 50, Anne would get 60, and that's
correct.
Proportional representation
That's correct.
of that division.
That's right.
Right.
Okay, so that's just a wee thing on the proportion. Now, to try and explain what happens with a surplus, I've come up with a few simple numbers here. So I'm going to try and keep the numbers to a minimum. Let's say we're in a constituency and we've already decided that the quota is 7,000 votes. We won't worry about where that came from now. And we have 4 candidates in the election. So we will just name the 4 names in alphabetical order. There's Bellew, there's Murphy, there's O'Gogan, and there's Smith. So just to say those names again. There's Bellew, there's Murphy, there's O'Gogan, and there's Smith. Now, at the end of the first count, Bellew got 10,000 votes. Now, just to keep things simple, I'm not going to tell the listeners how many votes any other candidate got, because at this stage, they don't really need to know, and we won't complicate the thing with too many numbers. So far, we've only 2 numbers. We know that Bellew got 10,000 votes, and the quota was 7,000 votes. So that means Bellew has 3,000 spare votes.
And they're called surplus votes.
And that's called surplus. So that's 3,000 votes that can now be distributed to the other candidates who are still in the race. So the other candidates again were Murphy, O'Gogan, and Smith. Now, how do we actually distribute those 3,000 votes? What we do is, or what the counters do, they actually go back to the 10,000 votes that Bellew got in the first count. So those 10,000 papers say Bellew number 1. And now we're going to look at the number 2s.
From those papers.
From those papers. So we go through the process, and to keep the numbers simple, let's say Murphy ended up getting half of those votes.
Which it would be 5,000.
Which would be 5,000 number 2s for Murphy. They say number 1 Bellew, now they say number 2 Murphy. So Murphy gets 5,000 of those votes. O'Gogan gets a third of them, so that's 3,333. And the last guy, Smith, gets a sixth of them. That's 1,667. You add up those 3 numbers.
And you get 10,000.
You get 10,000.
So again, just to recap.
Recap the numbers.
There was 10,000 votes for Bellew.
Number 1.
Number 1.
Yeah.
And when we go through and divide the number 2s, there's still 10,000.
We look at the
5,000 have been given to one, 3,333, the other one, and 1,666.
And they all add up. That's the 10,000 votes. So again, just to summarise the numbers, Murphy got 5,000. That was half the 10,000. O'Gogan got 3,333. That was a third of the 10,000. And Smith got a sixth of the 10,000. That was 1,667. And that's all at the number 2 level. Now, there's only 3,000 votes available to be transferred. Bellew still needs to hold on to
his 7,000.
7,000. So what we do is we just go in the proportion.
You've been listening to dkitalk.com.